The ballroom glowed with golden lights and laughter floated through the air like bubbles in champagne. It was the kind of evening where people wore their best clothes and even better masks. Everyone wanted to be seen, but no one wanted to be truly known. Among them stood a man whose name carried more weight than the gold buttons on his jacket. He was the youngest millionaire in the city, known for his charm, confidence, and the kind of smile that could buy silence from anyone who dared to speak against him. He was surrounded by people, all laughing at his jokes, all pretending to be his friends. But behind those polite smiles, they whispered stories about his arrogance and how no one ever dared to stand up to him. He enjoyed that power. It made him feel alive. That night he was in his element, walking among his guests like a king enjoying his court. At the edge of the grand hall, a woman in a plain black uniform stood quietly, watching the celebration from a distance. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. She was there to clean, not to be seen. Her hands smelled faintly of soap and her back ached from hours of sweeping, wiping, and carrying trays. But still her eyes sparkled with a strange calm. She didn't belong to that world, yet there was something graceful about the way she carried herself. Every so often she would pause to look at the grand piano in the corner. It was a shining white masterpiece that seemed untouched all night. Guests passed by it without care, treating it like another decoration. But for her it was something sacred. Her father had once taught her how to play on an old broken piano back in their small apartment. She remembered how his hands had guided hers, showing her how to feel the music, not just play it. Those days felt like another life. She had dreams once, dreams of being on a stage wearing a dress instead of a uniform, with people listening, not commanding. But life didn't ask for her permission before changing. When her father fell sick, music became a luxury she couldn't afford. Cleaning jobs were easier to find than piano lessons, and survival had to come before dreams. As she worked that night, her heart was full of memories. She hummed softly to herself while she polished the tables. The sound caught the attention of one of the guests, the millionaire himself. He turned amused and walked toward her. The crowd followed, eager for a distraction. He was known for his playful cruelty, for the way he liked to test people just to see how far they'd go before breaking. "What's that you're humming?" he asked, his tone light but sharp. "You seem too happy for someone cleaning up after us." She straightened her back and looked at him calmly. "Just a song my father used to play," she said. He raised a brow. "Oh, do you play too?" She nodded slightly. "I used to," he laughed, a sound that made a few guests chuckle nervously. "Used to, that's a shame. Maybe you should show us." Her cheeks flushed. "Sir, I'm just the cleaner." He grinned. "Then prove me wrong. Play for us. If you play well, I'll give you a reward." He paused dramatically, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Play it and I'll marry you." The room burst into laughter. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and she felt her throat tighten. It was supposed to be a joke, another one of his arrogant games, but something in her heart told her to say yes. Not because she believed his words, but because for once she wanted to be seen, not as a cleaner, not as a nobody, but as someone who had something worth hearing. The crowd waited, expecting her to refuse and walk away. Instead, she slowly set down the cloth she was holding and walked toward the piano. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the millionaire looked slightly taken aback. She sat on the bench, her hands trembling. It had been years since she had touched a piano. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let her fingers rest on the keys. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then music filled the room, soft at first like a whisper of rain, then rising, blooming like sunlight after a storm. Every note carried a story of struggle, loss, and hope. She didn't play to impress them. She played because the music was still inside her, waiting to be heard. People stopped moving. Glasses froze midair. The laughter died. The millionaire's smirk faded, replaced by something softer, something unsure. Her eyes glistened, but her hands never faltered. The sound wrapped around the room, breaking through pride and pretense. For the first time that night, the air felt real. When the last note faded, she lifted her hands slowly and stood up. There was silence, deep, heavy silence. Then came the applause. It started with one person, then another, until the whole room erupted in claps and cheers. The millionaire stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. He tried to speak but couldn't find the words. She gave a small smile, bowed her head slightly, and turned to leave. Before she reached the door, he called out to her. Wait. His voice was quieter now, stripped of arrogance. She paused and turned. You said you'd marry me if I played, she said softly, her tone calm but firm. A few people laughed again, but this time the laughter sounded awkward, uncertain. He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. I did say that, he replied, his voice low. And you played better than anyone I've ever heard. She nodded once. Then that's enough. And she walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget what they had witnessed. That night the millionaire couldn't sleep. The music replayed in his mind again and again. He thought about her hands, her courage, and how easily she had turned his joke into something meaningful. For the first time in years he felt small, not because of her but because of himself. He realized that all his wealth, all his charm couldn't buy what she had: honesty, strength, and heart. The next morning he sent people to find her. But no one seemed to know much about her. The cleaning company said she had worked part-time, never spoke much, and never asked for help. He couldn't explain why he wanted to see her again. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something else, something that made him want to understand her story. Meanwhile, she was back in her small apartment, folding her uniform neatly. Her mother was asleep in the next room, coughing softly in her sleep. On the table lay a small music book, its pages yellowed with age. She ran her fingers over the notes and smiled faintly. She hadn't expected anything from that night. But she had played, and for once she had been heard. That was enough for her. Still, as she looked at her hands, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull, as if her music had changed something she couldn't yet see. Somewhere out there, the man who had once mocked her was now remembering her not as the cleaner, but as the woman who had made a room full of strangers believe in something again. Always show details from Doc's import document. Create the document doc. Document. Part 2 content, around 1,400 words. Human-centric, emotional, simple language text. Days turned into weeks, but the sound of that piano still followed him everywhere he went. No matter how busy he tried to be, the music played again in his mind whenever he sat alone. It was strange for him. He had been to countless concerts and parties, heard world-famous performers, but none of them had touched him the way that one woman's song had. It wasn't just her skill. It was the truth in her music that had shaken him. He found himself sitting by the same piano again one evening, long after everyone had gone home. The hall was quiet now, just faint echoes of laughter and footsteps fading away. He placed his hand on the keys, pressing one softly. The sound came out dull compared to the memory of her playing. He sighed, realizing that maybe what made her performance special wasn't just the notes. It was her heart. He had asked his assistant to find her, but no one seemed to know much. She had disappeared as quietly as she had appeared. The cleaning company said she no longer worked there. She hadn't left a number or an address. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Still, something in him refused to let go. Meanwhile, she had gone back to her usual life. Her days were filled with chores, caring for her mother, and taking small cleaning jobs wherever she could. She didn't expect to ever hear from that man again. To her, that night was already a lifetime away, a moment that had given her strength but was not meant to last. Yet, a small part of her heart still remembered the way the room went silent when she played, the way for once people actually listened. One afternoon, while she was walking home from the market, she noticed a car parked near the narrow street where she lived. A man in a suit stepped out holding an envelope. He looked out of place in that neighborhood. When he approached her, she hesitated, unsure if he was lost. He asked her name softly, and when she nodded, he handed her the envelope. "It's from Mr. Royce," he said politely before leaving. She stood there for a long time, staring at the envelope. Inside was a simple note written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for the music. Please meet me if you can." Along with it was a card with the address of a concert hall. She didn't know what to make of it. Part of her wanted to throw it away. Another part of her wanted to know why someone like him would bother reaching out to someone like her. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of that piano, the laughter and his expression as she played kept coming back. Finally, she decided she would go, not for him, but for herself. She needed to know what this was about. The next day she stood outside the concert hall, her hands cold from nerves. When she entered, the hall was empty except for him, sitting near the stage. He stood up when he saw her and gave a faint, unsure smile. Gone was the arrogance from that night. He looked different, quieter, almost humble. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. She looked around the hall, her voice steady. "I wasn't planning to." "I wanted to thank you," he said. "What you did that night, it reminded me of something I forgot. I don't even know how to describe it." "You don't have to," she replied. "It was just music." He shook his head. "It wasn't just music. It was something real." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Then he said, "Would you play again?" "Not for me, for yourself. I want to hear it the right way this time." She hesitated, unsure. "I don't play in public anymore." "This isn't public," he said softly. "It's just us." Something in his tone made her believe him. So she sat down at the piano once more. This time there were no people watching, no laughter, no expectations. Just her and the sound of the keys. She began to play, and he closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It felt like time had stopped. When she finished, she looked up and saw that he was quietly wiping his eyes. It startled her. She had never expected someone like him to cry. He laughed a little, embarrassed. "I guess I deserve that," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied softly. "Sometimes people just need to listen." He smiled at that, and for the first time it wasn't a smile meant to impress anyone. It was just real. He told her how he had grown up surrounded by people who cared more about his money than about him. How success had made him proud but also empty. He admitted that her performance had been the first time in years he had felt anything honest. They talked for a long time that day. It wasn't about music or money. It was about simple things, family, choices, memories. He learned that her mother had been sick for years, and that she worked multiple jobs just to pay for medicine. She learned that despite all his wealth, he had been lonely for most of his life. Before she left, he said quietly, "I'm organizing a charity event next month. Would you play there? I'll make sure you're paid fairly." She hesitated. "You think people would want to hear me?" "I know they would," he said with a smile. "They just don't know it yet." She thought about it for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'll try." When she walked home that day, something inside her felt lighter. For the first time in years, she had played for someone who truly listened. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about finding herself again. The following weeks passed quickly. She practiced every evening after finishing her work, using an old keyboard that sometimes missed notes. Her mother would sit nearby, listening with a gentle smile. "You're coming back to life," her mother said one night, and she laughed softly. "Maybe I am," she replied. Meanwhile, the man prepared for the event. This time it wasn't about showing off. He wanted to make it meaningful, to raise money for people who needed it. Something in him had changed since that night. His friends noticed it too. He wasn't as quick to mock or to show off. He seemed more thoughtful, though he never said why. When the night of the event arrived, the hall was filled again, but this time the energy was different. There were no cruel jokes, no mocking laughter. People were curious about the mysterious woman who had once silenced an entire ballroom. Backstage, she was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took deep breaths to steady herself. He found her there and said softly, "You don't have to prove anything tonight. Just play." She nodded, feeling comforted by his calm tone. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience grew quiet. The lights dimmed and she sat at the piano. Then she began to play. This time the music was brighter. It wasn't full of pain, it was full of hope. The sound filled the hall like sunlight spilling through windows. People leaned forward, drawn in by the warmth in her notes. It was as if she was telling them a story without words, of hardship, faith, and strength. When she finished, there was silence for a moment, then thunderous applause. She stood bowing slightly, her eyes shining. In the crowd, she saw him clapping, a proud smile on his face. He didn't look like a man showing off his success. He looked like someone grateful just to be there. After the event, people approached her asking if she taught, if she recorded music. She was overwhelmed but deeply touched. For the first time, her dream didn't feel impossible anymore. As the hall emptied, he walked up to her. "You were incredible," he said sincerely. She smiled. "Thank you for believing I could do it." He shook his head. "You just reminded me what real beauty is. Not what money can buy, but what honesty creates." They stood there for a while in comfortable silence. Finally, she said, "I should go. My mother's waiting." He nodded. "Let me send a car for you." She shook her head gently. "No, I'll walk. I like the quiet." As she walked out into the cool night air, she looked up at the stars and smiled. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. Somewhere inside her, the music kept playing, soft, steady, and alive. But the days after the concert felt like a dream to her. For the first time, people had called her by her name, not by her job. She was no longer just the cleaner who worked in the background. She had become the woman whose music touched hearts. But what made her happiest wasn't the applause or the attention. It was the feeling that she had finally found her way back to something she had lost long ago. She continued to visit the concert hall, sometimes just to practice. The staff treated her kindly now, offering her tea and warm smiles whenever she arrived. Life hadn't suddenly become easy, but it had become brighter. Her mother's health seemed to improve too, perhaps because she saw hope return to her daughter's face. The man who had once teased her started visiting the hall often as well. At first, she thought he was only being polite, checking in after the event. But over time, his visits became more personal. He would sit quietly while she practiced, listening without interrupting. Sometimes he would bring her a small meal or coffee, saying she shouldn't play on an empty stomach. It was a simple gesture, but it felt genuine. One afternoon, after she finished playing, he said softly, "You know, I used to think I understood success. I thought it meant being admired, having more than others. But when I watched you play, I realized that real success is being at peace with yourself." She smiled gently. "Peace doesn't come easy," she said. "You have to lose everything first before you learn what really matters." He nodded, looking thoughtful. "Then maybe I'm still learning." They talked often after that. Their conversations were never about money or fame. They spoke about life, childhood memories, and small dreams. He told her about his father, a strict man who had pushed him into business when he was barely out of school. She shared stories of her father, too, how he used to fix broken things around the house with a smile even when they had nothing. It was strange how two people from such different worlds could find comfort in the same kind of memories. Weeks passed, and he invited her to join a small project his company was planning, an outreach program to support young musicians who couldn't afford instruments or lessons. He said her story had inspired him to start it. At first, she was unsure if she fit into that world, but he convinced her that her experience made her the perfect mentor. When the program launched, she found herself standing in front of a group of children holding second-hand instruments. Their eyes were full of wonder, and for the first time she realized how much she had to give. She taught them simple melodies, showing them how to listen, how to feel, how to find their own sound. The joy she saw on their faces reminded her of her younger self, sitting beside her father and learning to play for the first time. He watched her from a distance that day, smiling quietly. He had seen her transform, from someone who cleaned floors to someone who changed lives. He couldn't explain why her happiness mattered to him so much. He just knew that it did. Their friendship grew naturally. They began meeting outside the hall, sometimes for tea, sometimes for quiet walks in the park. The people around them noticed how different he had become. The once arrogant millionaire now spoke with softness in his tone, and his laughter had lost its edge. Even his business partners noticed he was no longer chasing the next deal with the same hunger. Something inside him had shifted, but not everyone saw this change kindly. A few of his old acquaintances started gossiping. Some said he was being foolish, wasting time with someone who had nothing to offer him. Others mocked the idea that a cleaner could have any influence on a man of his status. The rumors reached her eventually, whispered behind polite smiles and sideways glances. She tried to ignore them, but the words stung. One evening, after teaching her students, she sat alone at the piano, her hands still. He found her there, staring at the keys. "You didn't play today," he said gently. She looked up, her voice soft. "Maybe I shouldn't. People are talking. They think I'm trying to take advantage of you." He frowned. "Do you believe that?" "No," she said quickly. "But I don't want to cause you trouble." "You've been kind to me, and I don't want anyone to think—" He interrupted her, his tone calm but firm. "Let them think what they want. You don't owe anyone an explanation," she sighed. "That's easy for you to say. You're used to being talked about. I'm not." He paused for a moment, then said quietly, "Maybe I should be the one to tell them the truth." She looked at him, puzzled. "What truth?" "That you're the first person who's ever made me want to be better," he said simply. Her breath caught for a moment, and she looked away, unsure how to respond. The silence between them was filled with unspoken feelings, gentle, uncertain, but real. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened. They worked together on the music program, attended local events, and even visited small towns to donate instruments. People began to notice the change not just in him, but in her too. She carried herself with more confidence, spoke with warmth, and smiled easily. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. One day, during a visit to a small community center, one of the children asked her, "Miss, were you really a cleaner before?" The question made her pause. She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I was. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with what you have." The boy grinned. "Then maybe I can be like you someday." She laughed softly. "You'll be better than me." That night, as they drove back to the city, she sat quietly, watching the lights pass by. He looked over at her and said, "You've changed their lives, you know." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I think they've changed mine more." He didn't say anything after that. He just looked at her, realizing how much she had changed his life too. As the months went by, the music program grew. More sponsors joined, and more children got the chance to learn. The media began to take notice. Articles were written about the project, and interviews were requested. She was uncomfortable with the attention, but he encouraged her to share her story. "People need to hear it," he said. "You'll inspire others." During one interview, a reporter asked her what she thought of the man who had started it all. She smiled and said, "He once made a joke that changed my life, but I think the real change happened when he decided to listen." When he read that later, he couldn't help but smile. He realized that her words carried more truth than she probably knew, because listening to her had changed him too. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she sometimes wondered if their worlds could ever truly meet. He was surrounded by people of influence and luxury, while she still lived in the same small apartment, caring for her mother and counting every coin. She feared that one day he might drift back to his old world, leaving her behind like a chapter closed too soon. But every time she thought that, he would appear, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with a simple question like, "Have you eaten?" or "Did you practice today?" And each time she felt that maybe she didn't have to worry so much. Maybe some connections didn't need to fit into logic. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she found a small gift waiting for her at the piano. It was a music box, beautifully crafted with a note that said, "For the one who reminded me what real music sounds like." She turned the key and listened as a soft melody played. It was her song, the same one she had performed that night months ago. She closed her eyes and smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was far from over. The winter wind had started to bite, brushing against her face as she walked to the concert hall early one morning. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before the city wakes up. She liked this time of day. It was peaceful and she could think. Lately, her thoughts were filled with music, her students and him. The music program had grown faster than anyone expected. Schools were reaching out, local businesses were donating instruments, and even people from other cities wanted to join. What started as one idea had become something that changed lives. She often found herself amazed by how much things had changed in such a short time. But she also knew that it wouldn't have been possible without him. He had used his name and influence to support the cause, but he never tried to take the spotlight. He always stayed in the background, watching her lead, encouraging her to speak, to teach, to believe in herself. Sometimes she wondered why he cared so much. Maybe he was making up for the man he used to be. Or maybe, she thought quietly, he just truly believed in her. That morning he was already there when she arrived, sitting at the edge of the stage with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked tired but peaceful. "You're early," she said, smiling as she approached. "So are you," he replied. "I couldn't sleep. Something wrong?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "No, just thinking. You ever have one of those nights where you keep wondering how you got here? How everything changed?" She smiled softly. "All the time." He looked at her for a moment and said quietly, "You've made me realize how little I used to listen. Not just to people, but to life itself." She sat beside him, her hands wrapped around her warm coffee cup. "We all stop listening sometimes," she said. "The world gets too loud. You have to lose something to hear clearly again. He nodded, then smiled faintly. You always have a way of saying things that sound simple but feel important. She laughed quietly. I just speak how I feel. There was a gentle silence between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It was full of understanding, of things they didn't need to say. Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side to prepare for a big charity concert. It was going to be the largest event the program had ever done. Musicians from all over the city were coming to perform, and the proceeds would go toward building a small music school for underprivileged children. The idea of having a permanent place for young talent filled her with hope, but with success came challenges. Sponsors wanted control over certain aspects of the event. Journalists wanted personal interviews, and rumors began to stir again. Some said he was using the project for publicity. Others whispered that their friendship was more than it appeared. She tried to ignore it, but it bothered her. She didn't want the good they were doing to be overshadowed by gossip. One evening, after a long meeting with sponsors, she found him sitting alone in his office, staring at the city lights through the tall glass windows. He looked lost in thought. You okay? She asked quietly. He turned and gave a tired smile. Just thinking how strange people can be. You try to do something good and somehow they still find a way to twist it? She nodded slowly. That's because some people only see what they want to see. You can't change that, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. You know, before I met you, I wouldn't have cared what people said. But now it bothers me. Not because of me, but because of you. I don't want anyone to hurt your name, she smiled softly. It's just noise. Let it pass. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, You're stronger than me, you know that? She laughed. I doubt that. I don't, he said. You face the world with calm. I hide behind my money. You walk through storms and I buy umbrellas. His honesty made her heart ache a little. She wanted to tell him that he wasn't the man he used to be, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said gently, Maybe that's how we balance each other out. He smiled faintly and the tension in the room lifted. The day of the charity concert arrived faster than anyone expected. The hall was packed, the lights glowed warmly, and the air buzzed with anticipation. She stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. He walked over, dressed in a simple black suit, his expression calm. You ready? He asked. She nodded, but her voice shook slightly. A little nervous, he smiled. That's good. It means you care. The concert began with children performing simple melodies, each one proud and glowing. She watched them with tears in her eyes. It reminded her of her own beginnings, of the dreams she once thought she had lost. Then it was her turn. As she walked to the piano, the crowd applauded warmly. She took a deep breath, sat down, and began to play. This time the music was different. It wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had struggled, everyone who had fought to hold on to hope. The audience was silent, hanging on every note. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. She stood, smiling through tears, as he walked onto the stage beside her. He took the microphone and spoke quietly. Tonight isn't about me or even about music alone. It's about what happens when someone refuses to give up, when one person's courage reminds us what really matters. He turned to her, his voice softening. You changed the way I see the world. You reminded me what kindness looks like. The audience clapped again, touched by his words. She felt her heart swell, not from pride, but from gratitude. For once, she felt seen not as a cleaner, not as a performer, but as someone who had made a difference. After the concert, reporters surrounded them, asking for comments, taking photos. She tried to stay polite, but was clearly uncomfortable. He noticed and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. That's enough for tonight, he said, guiding her away. They stepped outside into the cool night air. The noise of the city felt far away. She exhaled deeply, smiling. That went better than I expected. He nodded, his eyes full of quiet admiration. You were amazing. She looked up at the sky. It still feels unreal. Sometimes I think I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream. He shook his head. If it's a dream, it's mine too. And I don't want to wake up. She laughed softly. You've become a poet now, he smiled. Maybe you bring that out in me. There was a pause between them, the kind that held meaning without words. She looked at him and saw something in his eyes. Something deeper than friendship, but gentle and careful, as if he was afraid to break what they had. As weeks passed after the concert, The program continued to grow. The new music school began construction, and she was named its first director. It was something she never imagined possible. When he handed her the keys to the small building one morning, she felt her eyes fill with tears. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You earned it," he said simply. "This is yours. You built it." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "You did this for me." He shook his head. "No, I did it because of you." She didn't know what to say. The weight of gratitude and emotion pressed in her chest. For a long moment, they just stood there, both understanding that their connection had become something that words couldn't fully explain. But deep down, she knew that her journey wasn't over. Life had a way of testing people when they least expected it. She didn't know what challenges were waiting ahead, but one thing was clear. She was no longer afraid of them, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking alone. The days after the opening of the music school felt like a dream. Every morning, the sound of laughter, soft music, and children's voices filled the air. She loved watching them arrive, some with old, scratched instruments, others with nothing but curiosity and hope. To her, each child was a story waiting to be told. She walked through the bright hallways one morning, stopping to listen to a young boy playing the violin. He struggled at first, missing notes, his face tense with frustration. She knelt beside him and said gently, "Don't think about the mistakes. Just listen to how it feels." The boy nodded, took a breath, and played again. The notes weren't perfect, but they carried emotion. She smiled, knowing he would get there. Patience, she always said, was the real key to music and to life. He had been away on business for a few days, and the school felt a little emptier without him around. She didn't like to admit it, but his presence had become a kind of comfort. He had a way of filling a room even when he wasn't talking, just by being there. When he returned, he walked straight to the practice room, where she was sitting on the floor surrounded by sheets of music. "You're working too hard again," he said, his voice teasing but kind. She looked up and smiled. "Someone has to keep this place running." He laughed softly. "And that someone doesn't know how to rest?" She shrugged, trying to hide her tired eyes. "I'm fine." He didn't argue. Instead, he sat down beside her, picking up one of the pages. "You wrote this?" She nodded. "It's a new piece for the next student concert." He read the notes carefully, then looked at her. "You put feelings into paper better than most people do into words." Her cheeks warmed a little. "Maybe because feelings are easier than words." He smiled faintly. "Not for everyone." Their eyes met for a moment, one of those quiet moments where everything else fades away. But before it could turn into something deeper, one of the children ran in, waving a paper and shouting with excitement. She laughed and turned to the child, breaking the silence that had started to grow heavy with meaning. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, the two of them stood outside watching the sky turn gold. The city lights were flickering on in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of rain. He looked at the school building, then at her. "You've built something beautiful," he said quietly. "We built it," she corrected. He smiled. "You're still too humble," she laughed. "And you're still too generous." He leaned against the wall, his tone softer now. "Do you ever think about what's next?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe I'm scared to think too far ahead. Every time I planned my life, it fell apart. Now I just take each day as it comes." He nodded slowly. "I used to plan everything. Every meeting, every deal, every move. But lately..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Lately, I just want to feel alive." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't feel alive?" He gave a faint, sad smile. "Not until recently." Her chest tightened at the honesty in his voice. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but words felt too small. So instead, she stood beside him in silence, letting the wind carry the unspoken feelings between them. As weeks passed, whispers began spreading again. Some people didn't like how close they seemed. Others questioned her sudden success. There were rumors that she only got where she was because of him. She tried to ignore it, but deep down it hurt. She had worked so hard to be seen for who she truly was. One afternoon, a group of journalists came to the school without warning. They asked questions that sounded kind but were full of traps. "How did a cleaner rise so quickly? Do you think your connection with him helped your career? Are you two more than just partners in this project?" She stayed calm, answering politely, though her heart pounded. "The only connection that matters is music," she said simply. But when she saw the articles the next day, her stomach dropped. The headlines twisted her words, painting her as an opportunist. The comments online were even worse. People she didn't know accused her of pretending to be humble. Some said she was just lucky. Others were crueler. She didn't leave her apartment for 2 days. The phone kept ringing, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. When he finally came knocking, she almost didn't open the door. But when she saw his face and worried, tired yet gentle, she stepped aside. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said quietly. He nodded. "I have." She turned away, her voice shaking. "It's humiliating. Everything I've worked for. They're saying it's all because of you." He walked closer. "You don't believe that, do you?" "No, but everyone else does," she said, her eyes filling. "And I don't know how to prove them wrong." He paused, then said softly, "You don't have to prove anything. The people who matter already know the truth." She shook her head. "It's not that simple. You don't know what it's like to be looked down on all your life, and then, when you finally rise, to have people say you don't deserve it." He was quiet for a long time, then said, "You're right. I don't know. But I know what it's like to lose everything that makes you proud. And I learned something. Other people's opinions can only define you if you let them." His words stayed with her long after he left that night. She couldn't sleep, so she walked through the empty school halls. The lights were dim, and the echo of her footsteps filled the air. She stopped in front of the piano and sat down. Her fingers touched the keys, and slowly she began to play. The music came out raw, full of pain, anger, but also strength. It was her answer to the world. The next morning, she walked into the studio and gathered the students. She smiled, though her eyes were still tired. "I want you to remember something," she told them. "People will always have something to say. But music tells the truth. So when words hurt, let the notes speak for you." Her calmness inspired them, and slowly the negativity started to fade. People began to focus again on what really mattered: the music, the children, the message of hope. He watched her handle it all with quiet admiration. She didn't lash out, didn't fight back. She just kept building, teaching, creating. It humbled him. He realized how much he had changed, how much she had changed him. One evening, he asked her to walk with him by the river. The air was cool and the city lights shimmered on the water. "You know," he said softly, "when I first met you, I thought I was doing you a favor. I thought I was helping you." She glanced at him curiously. "And now?" He smiled gently. "Now I know it was the other way around." She looked away, her heart full. "I didn't do anything special." He shook his head. "You did everything special. You reminded me what it means to be human." There was a long pause. The world around them was quiet except for the gentle sound of the river. He looked at her, his expression serious now. "You know, I never meant for things to get this far. To feel this much." She turned to him, her breath catching. "What are you saying?" He hesitated, searching her eyes. "I think I've fallen for you." For a moment, the world stopped. She didn't speak. Her heart pounded, her mind racing. She had imagined this moment, but now that it was real, it felt overwhelming. Finally, she whispered, "You shouldn't say that." He smiled sadly. "I know, but I had to." She looked away, her voice soft. "Our worlds are different. You belong up there, and I belong here." He stepped closer. "You belong wherever you want to be. You've already proved that." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. "You've changed too." He nodded. "Because of you." They stood there in silence as the night wrapped around them. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was clear. The line between them had blurred. What began as a teasing challenge had turned into something neither of them expected. Something real, fragile, and powerful. And though neither said it aloud, both knew that their story was far from over. Spring had arrived, bringing soft sunlight and a new sense of calm to the city. The trees near the music school were blooming again, their petals falling like snowflakes in slow motion. She stood outside one morning, watching the children chase each other across the courtyard. Their laughter echoed against the walls, and she smiled, feeling a quiet joy she hadn't felt in years. Inside, the halls buzzed with life. New students had joined, and the school had become a symbol of second chances. Local artists came to volunteer, and families from all walks of life gathered for weekend performances. Every note that echoed through those rooms carried a story of hope, courage, and dreams that refused to die. He had been spending more time at the school lately, Not as the man everyone knew from business headlines, but as someone who wanted to be part of something real. He would sit quietly during rehearsals, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just listening. There was a calmness about him now, a gentleness that had replaced the arrogance he once wore like armor. One afternoon, she found him in the small garden behind the school, watering the plants with a small metal can. She laughed softly. "You gardening?" He looked up, smiling. "Don't sound so surprised. I can do simple things too." She raised an eyebrow playfully. "I just didn't think you'd have the patience," he chuckled. "I didn't before, but I'm learning." She sat on the nearby bench watching him. "You really have changed." He paused, setting the can down. "You make it sound like I was terrible before." She smiled gently. "Maybe not terrible, just lost." He nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we both were." Their eyes met for a long moment, a quiet exchange that said more than words could. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was understanding, connection, something built slowly and carefully through shared moments. A few days later, the city announced that the music school would receive an award for its contribution to the community. It was a huge honor, one that would bring attention from all over the country. When she heard the news, she felt both proud and nervous. She wasn't used to standing in the spotlight. "You deserve it," he said when she told him. "You've worked harder than anyone." She shook her head. "We all did. It's never just one person." He smiled. "That's what makes you different." The award ceremony was held at a grand theater downtown. She wore a simple dress, elegant but modest. He arrived in a dark suit, but there was nothing flashy about him that night. When she walked onto the stage to accept the award, she saw him in the front row, smiling proudly. His expression was full of quiet admiration, not the kind that came from possession but from respect. When she gave her speech, her voice was calm but full of emotion. "This school was built on second chances," she said. "Not just for the children who learn here, but for all of us who needed to believe again. Music doesn't care where you come from. It listens to your heart." The audience rose in applause. She saw tears in a few faces, and for a moment she had to look down to steady herself. It was overwhelming. Not the fame, not the attention, but the realization that her pain had turned into something beautiful. After the ceremony, people crowded around her, congratulating and asking for photos. She smiled politely, but when she finally caught his eyes across the room, she felt relief. He walked toward her, and when they stood face to face, neither spoke for a moment. "You did it," he said softly. "We did," she corrected. He laughed quietly. "You'll never take full credit, will you?" "Maybe that's my charm," she said, smiling. He looked at her for a long second before saying, "It's more than that." The evening ended with them walking outside together. The city lights shimmered, the air was cool, and the noise of the world felt far away. For a moment, everything was still. He stopped, looking out over the skyline. "You know," he said quietly, "the first time I met you, I was a different person. I thought I had everything, money, power, control. But I didn't have peace. You gave me that." She turned to him, her eyes soft. "I didn't give you anything. You found it yourself," he smiled faintly. "Maybe. But you showed me where to look." They stood in silence for a while, just watching the city glow. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. Sometimes love was quiet, steady like a heartbeat, strong enough to stay even without words. Weeks passed, and life went on as usual. The school continued to grow and their bond deepened. But not everything was easy. With success came new challenges, more attention, more pressure. He was offered a major international project that would require him to move abroad for nearly a year. When he told her, her heart sank even though she tried to hide it. "You should take it," she said, forcing a smile. "It's a great opportunity." He studied her face carefully. "You want me to go?" "I want you to do what makes you happy." He hesitated. "You'd be okay without me here?" She nodded, though her voice wavered. "I was okay before I met you. I'll be okay now." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he said softly, "That's what I admire about you, your strength." But inside she felt a quiet ache. For days after he left, the school felt different, quieter, emptier. She threw herself into work, teaching longer hours, writing new pieces. At night, she sometimes sat by the piano, her fingers tracing melodies that reminded her of him. They talked occasionally through video calls, but it wasn't the same. Time zones, schedules, and distance made things harder. And yet every time she heard his voice, it brought a warmth she couldn't explain. Months passed like that. Then one evening, as the school was preparing for another big concert, she received a letter. It wasn't an email, not a message. An actual letter written in his neat handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. In it, he wrote about his days away, how busy he had been, how much he missed the quiet mornings at the school, the laughter of the children, and her music filling the halls. He wrote about how he had finally realized something important. Success feels empty without someone to share it with. At the end, there was a small note. Save me a seat at the next concert. I'm coming home. When she read those words, her eyes filled with tears. She pressed the letter to her chest and smiled. He was coming back. The night of the concert, the hall was full again. The children played beautifully, their music lifting everyone's spirits. But she kept glancing at the door, waiting. As the final song began, her heart sank. He still hadn't arrived, and then, just as the last notes faded, she saw movement near the entrance. He stood there, still in his coat, smiling as if he'd been there all along. Their eyes met across the room, and everything else disappeared. She didn't need words. The look in his eyes said enough. After the applause, she walked toward him. The children surrounded them, cheering, laughing. He handed her a small velvet box, but instead of opening it right away, she looked at him questioningly. He smiled. You once said you'd never believe in promises made in words alone. So I waited until I could prove it. She slowly opened the box. Inside wasn't a ring, but a small silver charm shaped like a music note. Simple, delicate, and meaningful. He took her hand. This isn't about what I can give you. It's about what we built together. But if someday you decide you want more, I'll be right here. Her eyes glistened. You don't have to say anything else. The children clapped, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing something beautiful. Laughter and music filled the hall again. The night felt alive, full of hope, love, and the kind of happiness that comes from hard-earned peace. Later, as the lights dimmed and the guests left, they stood on the stage together. The air was calm, the piano quiet. She turned to him and said softly, You remember the first thing you ever said to me? He smiled. Something foolish, probably. You said, play us and I'll marry you. She laughed softly. You were teasing, he chuckled. Maybe I wasn't. She looked up at him, her smile gentle. Maybe I'm ready to play again. He extended his hand toward the piano. Then play. She sat down, her fingers brushing the keys. The melody she played was soft and full of life. When she finished, he stepped closer, his voice quiet but sure. Then I guess I'll have to keep my promise. She laughed through tears, her heart full. It wasn't about wealth or titles anymore. It was about two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest way. A millionaire and a cleaner, both searching for meaning, finding love not in luxury but in kindness, patience, and shared dreams. The music lingered in the air, wrapping around them like a promise, one that would last long after the applause faded.